Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, the key to PMP exam success. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the Project Management Prepcast. I'm your instructor Cornelius Fichtner, and I do hope that you enjoyed your cup of tea as well. We will now review part 2 of the Plan Communications Management process. In the first part, we looked at the overview and we saw all the inputs, and in particular why we need them here and what some examples are of our enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Now, in part 2, we're moving on. Tools and techniques, outputs, and a review at the end are going to be our focus. We have 5 tools and techniques in this process. The first 4 are communication requirements analysis, the communication technology, the communication models, and the communication methods. And there's something very interesting that I noticed just before I started recording this lesson here. The 5th tool and technique is meetings, and we are currently in a process that contains the word plan communications management. So we use meetings to do all our planning. Interesting enough, when I check the PMBOK guide, plan cost management uses meetings, plan quality management uses meetings, plan human resource management uses meetings. And I checked every single process in the PMBOK guide, and what I found is that as soon as the process begins with plan followed by the knowledge area, so plan scope management, plan procurement management, etc., meetings is a tool and technique. Now that's just after a cursory review, but please do check. Go through the tools and techniques of the planning processes, the ones that are called plan, and see if you come up with the same result. And following this somewhat impromptu and unplanned homework that I've just given you, let's move on to our first tool and technique. Communication requirements analysis. That is a critical step in that you are gathering the information needs to properly plan your communications. The analysis of communication requirements determines the information needs of the stakeholders. These needs or requirements, they are defined by the type and format of information that is required by a particular stakeholder, as well as the value of that information to the particular stakeholder. In the analysis, the project manager needs to consider all the communication paths and channels, as this gives an indication of the project complexity with regards to communication. The more channels, the more people interacting you have, the more complex project communication gets. And finally, the requirements analysis is a key component of communications planning. It needs to determine and limit who communicates with whom. For example, you want someone very polished and corporate to interface with the public when representing your project. So you have that one speaker on your project communicating to the press. That again is one of those communication channels that you need to keep control of. And talking about communication channels, have you ever wondered how many people on your project talk to how many other people? Well, we do have a formula to calculate this. So whenever one stakeholder on your project communicates with another stakeholder, that is what we call a communication channel. And the number of these channels gives you some indication of how complex your project is. And this formula here can be used to determine the number of communication channels. This is the only formula in project communication management, and you must know it for the PMP exam. There is probably a 90% chance that you will encounter this again. So the formula reads N times N minus 1 divided by 2. N here stands for the number of people on your project. Let's take a look at this in an example. Let's assume you are holding a party for 100 team members. So the N up there in the formula is 100. If at the end of the evening each of your team members, each of your guests has spoken to every single other team member, so each of them needs to talk to 99 other people, how many communications have actually happened? Well, let's plug in the numbers here. So if N is 100, that means 100 times 100 minus 1 divided by 2 equals 4,950 communications that need to happen at your party. That is going to be a long party. But as you can see, applying the formula is very easy. All you have to know is how many people are in the group. That's N. Plug N into the formula and you have your result. When planning communications management, communications technology needs to be considered. What technologies are best suited to cover the communication needs of your project? Well, that depends on the type of information that you are trying to communicate, as well as various other factors. For example, timing. How quickly does information have to be available? Is a weekly status report enough, or do we need a project management information system, a PMIS, that has a dashboard view enabling everyone at a moment's notice to view the current status? We also have to consider availability and access, because if this PMIS is needed, do we even have such a technology available? If not, can we get one? And is the connection bandwidth in our office in Ottawa sufficient to access the system? We need to consider skills and tool complexity. Let's say that we are able to pull this off and get such a PMIS installed for the project. Well, does this mean that we need additional training for everyone on the team so that they can both input data and then properly get the reports that they need? And let's also consider a technological advance, because given that we have a 3-year project, is there a big technological change on the horizon that might help us in regards to communications technology? Well, let's not forget the project environment. Do we really need this type of PMIS for a team that is co-located in one corner of the building and who have a meeting set up daily in person anyway? Or is our company maybe virtual and spread out across several time zones? And lastly, let's not forget sensitivity and confidentiality. Is the information to be communicated sensitive and privileged? If so, what additional security measures do we need to put in place? These are just some of the factors that should be taken into consideration when deciding on the appropriate communication technology. You will probably remember this slide here. We saw this in our overview lesson on project communications. This is our basic communication model. There is a sequence of steps in this model that we go through, and it all begins with encoding the message. This is where thoughts and ideas are encoded into language, a message by the sender. Then we have to transmit the message. The information is sent by the sender using the communication channel or medium. Then we have factors that can affect or compromise the transmission. Those are things like distance, unfamiliar technology, inadequate infrastructure, cultural differences, or lack of background information, and we collectively call this noise. Then once the message has arrived at the other end, well, it needs to be decoded. This is where the message is translated by the receiver back into meaningful thoughts and ideas. Then, upon receipt of the message, the receiver may signal back that the message was received. An acknowledgement is sent back. This does not mean that the receiver agrees or has comprehended the message, just sort of a nodding saying, yep, I get what you're saying, I understood what you're saying, now I have to think about this first, and once I have thought about this for a while, well, I will give you my feedback, my response. So once the receiver has truly understood the message, they encode their thoughts and ideas into a response that is transmitted back to the original sender. So we have defined the communication channel as the path between two people that communicate. I talk to you, you talk to me, so we have one line of communication, we have one channel. But even though there exists only one path, one channel between you and I, we can use various methods to communicate over that single channel. We can use emails, I can give you a call, you can read my blog, we can communicate over Skype, or we could set up a podcast that uses an RSS feed. That is the PMP exam specific view of what a communication channel is and the communication method. Now let's talk about how people access the information that you provide on your project. As an example, let's take my brother. He's a senior executive and he works for a large British tour operator. When he originally got his first computer, he told me that the only thing he uses this thing for is to play solitaire. His secretary actually printed all his emails for him and would respond to those emails for him as he had written his notes onto the paper. Granted, that was years ago, but if he was a stakeholder on your project and you wanted to ensure that he received your information, you had better chosen a method that ensures that he receives your information in such a way that he can easily access it. Like send him a memo or call him up on the phone or stop by at his office. But to be fair, nowadays, my brother, he's improved his computer skills and he does indeed answer his own emails. And by an extremely strange coincidence, today's June 25th, yesterday, on June 24th, he actually called me over Skype for the first time in his life. But please, don't try to explain to him what a podcast is or an RSS feed or how he can access it. He still prefers paper. All right. Nice story, right? But why am I telling you this? Because it shows nicely that the communication method has to be appropriate for the recipient. To do this, you need to use all information that is available in the stakeholder register to assist you to meet the needs, especially the communication needs and requirements. You need to choose methods that are easily accessible to the stakeholder, and you need to consider all these factors. Choose a method that is appropriate given all the information about the needs and accessibility of the stakeholder that are at your disposal. Let's look at some of the communication methods available to choose from. Interactive communication is an exchange matrix where information is shared among participants, otherwise known as multi-directional interactive approach or interactive communications. Its purpose, the role of the sender and receiver changes constantly. It does have a drawback, and that is that all participants must be available at the same time to communicate, and that the volume of information that can be exchanged in such a way is limited. The advantage is, of course, that receipt and comprehension of the information can be verified. Common uses for this are chats, telephone calls, telephone conferences, or any other direct in-person communication. you could also use push communication. This is a one-way street approach to transmitting information that relies heavily on an action by the sender. Its purpose, obviously, is that the sender pushes the information to others. We're talking about a real one-way street. I send something to the recipients. The drawback is, well, that the sender has no real way of ensuring that the recipient has indeed received the information, has consumed the information, or even understood the information. The advantage, of course, is the sender can push the information to a large number of recipients at the same time. And in regards to common uses, we're talking here about status report, voicemails, podcasts, emails, press releases, letters, faxes, really anything that you as a single sender can send to one or multiple recipients, multiple stakeholders at the same time. And yes, where there is push communication, there is also pull communication, and this is relying on the recipient to retrieving the info. And by the way, this is what you are doing right now. So the purpose of pull communication is where the recipient of the information has to go and pull the information to him or her from whatever repository it was placed into. The drawback, again, the sender really has no way of ensuring that the recipient has received the information, consumed the information, or understood the information. In our situation right here, in this lesson, I have recorded this lesson. I have placed the lesson into our repository where we could have all our lessons, and then you as the student have accessed and downloaded this lesson. But there is no way for me to ensure that you are actually still listening to what I'm saying. Maybe you've gone away. Maybe you're checking your email in the background, and I need to now say, hello, I'm still here. Do come back. We have more to talk about. The advantage for me as the sender is that I can place large volumes of information into the repository, and you as the recipient, you can choose what you want to receive. Maybe you never even downloaded this lesson, so you will never hear what I am saying. Common uses here are obviously RSS feeds, blogs, forums, intranet websites, and yes, the project management Prepcast. Bottom line is you get the information when you want it. And this takes us to our fifth and final tool and technique, meetings. And I actually wonder how many of you in the meantime opened up the PMBOK guide to check whether or not what I found is indeed correct, that the first planning process in each of the knowledge areas does indeed contain meetings as a tool and technique. I'm not so sure about project integration management, but the others, I'm quite sure that this is the case. There are two reasons to call a meeting. First of all, you want to resolve a problem, or you want to make a decision. Otherwise, your stakeholder time is really wasted. A project manager who is known for having productive meetings is one who uses their stakeholders' time wisely. The byproduct of this approach of having productive meetings is better stakeholder participation. And this, of course, ends our section here on the tools and techniques. And I can already see your finger hovering over the pause button, because now you're going to open up the PMBOK guide to check about whether meetings is truly a tool and technique in all of those initial planning processes. And so we are moving on to the outputs of the plan communications management process. There are two of them, and the big one is, of course, the communications management plan. The project documents that you may be updating at this point are things like the project schedule, for instance, milestones for sending out additional information, or the stakeholder documentation. The Communications Management Plan is an important subsidiary plan of the Project Management Plan. It will be used as an input to two other processes, namely manage communications. That's the process that follows right after this one here. But we also hand it off to another knowledge area, to stakeholder management. We use this as well in manage stakeholder engagement. The communications management plan is constantly revisited throughout the project and updated when appropriate. That way it remains current and accurate as a living document should, which leads me into the other output of this process. There are two project documents that are usually impacted by the plan communications management process and therefore need to be updated. First of all, the project schedule, which links activities with planned dates, durations, milestones, and resources. And obviously, if we change something in our communications approach, this may need that communication needs to go out at a different time. So we have to update the project schedule. And we already talked about this briefly, stakeholder register, which includes the identification, assessment, classification of project stakeholders. And of course, if a stakeholder is added or removed from your project, or if they change their role within the project, well, you need to update all of this information. Updates to these documents needs to be timely and accurate. Why? Well, because they're used by other knowledge areas throughout the project, and you want to make sure that you update these as quickly as you know. And why do we need to do that? Because other knowledge areas, they're dependent on you for giving this timely and accurate input. And why that again? Well, because you as the project manager, you want your project to succeed. When it comes to sample questions from professional training companies, you will find that the communications formula is a central focus of these questions. So let's assume there are 5 people on the project. We have Joe, the project manager, we have Susan, we have Peter, Nitin, and Dora. So we have 5 people here on our project. The question could now be, if one more team member, Sam here, is added, how many channels do you now have? Well, it's quite simple if we apply the formula. Remember, n times n minus 1 divided by 2. And I said it's really simple if you know what n is. In our particular case here, n is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 people on our project. So it's 6 times 6 minus 1 is 5. So 6 times 5 is 30. We divide that by 2. We have 15 channels on a team with 6 people. There is another style of sample question that requires you to use the formula, but it requires you to use it twice. Here is the question. A team of 5 people is welcoming 2 new members. How many more communication channels have been added? So in the previous question, we simply said 1 team member gets added. How many channels do you now have? The question here is, how many more do you have when you add 2 new members to a 5-people team? Well, in order to answer this, you have to first calculate the number for a 7-people team. That's the final status. 5 plus the 2 new, that's 7. So 7 times 7 minus 1 divided by 2. Then you calculate it for the original number of 5. 5 times 5 minus 1 divided by 2. And then you simply subtract the 2 numbers. And I'll let you figure that one out on your own. Let's review. The main reason why we go through this process is because we want to develop the communications management plan, and much of what we document in this plan we reviewed in this lesson, beginning with the stakeholder communication needs, like you define who needs what information, when they will need it, how they will receive it, and from whom they will receive it. You also define the information format, content, level of detail that you will communicate. You might also make responsibility assignments by defining who is responsible for sending the information, and you may also define those groups who actually receive the information at the other end. We talked about methods, technologies, and frequency of sending information. And of course, since change is inevitable, there is also going to be a section in your plan that talks about the process of how the plan will be changed in the future. Like, when are we going to go and do a replanning of everything? How many times are we going to revisit this process here? And with that, we have come to the end of this lesson, Plan Communications Management. So it's time for Justine to say,
Peace out, brother.
and of course I say, until next time.